Give me a holler when it's live, Christina. Huh. Oh, all right, folks. Well, the presentation is now live for everyone else on the internet. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's come out in person to hear this talk, and anyone who's online who's tuned in. Before I jump into my presentation, I do want to just make a brief announcement, and that is the February 6th lecture has been canceled. But on March 6th, there's going to be a lecture on North Carolina whales. So I just want to put that all out there for you. So anyways, my name is David Bennett. I'm the curator of maritime history with the North Carolina Maritime Museums. And today we're going to be talking about colonial ports, pilotage and shipping in North Carolina. And so the ports that we're going to be discussing are the ports of, primarily are going to be the ports of entry, which is Port Roanoke, which is there with the black star. Port Currituck, which I'll get to later. We don't really know where Port Currituck was. In fact, most of the people during the colonial period didn't know where Port Currituck was either, even people living in North Carolina. Port Bath, as where Bath is today. Port Beaufort, where Beaufort is today, but also later encompassed New Bern as well. And then Port Brunswick, which is down where Brunswick town is, but it also later encompassed Wilmington. But before I kind of delve into this, I just want to sort of talk a little bit about the sort of economic framework that these colonial ports were operating under, and that's the sort of concept of mercantilism. Now, that term wasn't really developed, that term was developed by Adam Smith in the late colonial period, sort of right before the American Revolution. But basically, the most basic idea behind mercantilism was that the colonies existed primarily to extract raw resources out of them, send them back to England, where they would then be processed into sort of manufactured goods to fuel the British economy. And also then the British would be able to send those finished goods back to the colonies, and you would have this sort of self-contained imperial economy going on. Now, the balance of trade was always going to be in Britain's favor, so Britain was always going to make more money in the end. That's how the system was designed. But because there's so much maritime trade that's involved with this system, there's an increase in shipbuilding. You have more sailors, captains being trained. You have an expansion of the merchant marine, which is sort of the breeding ground, the learning ground for the Royal Navy. So whenever there's a time of war, there's all these sailors in the population that you can pull from to send into the Navy. So there's a national security aspect to this as well. Also, all this industry that's going on in England, including the maritime industry, it's increasing employment back home in the home islands. And then this is just sort of a self-sustaining economic model that where there's all these protectionist trade policies that sort of exist to sort of enforce this system. So this is kind of like a little bit of an outline almost for how I'll be talking about this. And Christine, the thing is not working. Okay, so but before I delve into all that, just a little bit about the geography. The primary inlets that are being used during the colonial period are Currituck Inlet, the one farthest north indicated by that red arrow. Then just below it, going south, you have Roanoke Inlet. Then you have Ocracoke Inlet, and then Beaufort Inlet, and then the two down at the bottom, the Cape Fear, the mouth of the Cape Fear River is the farthest south. It's the only river that empties directly, the only river in North Carolina that empties directly into the Atlantic. And then you have New Inlet just above right there. All right. So, you know, North Carolina coast, the graveyard of the Atlantic, you have all these shifting shoals. It's dangerous, but also the inlets are incredibly dangerous and difficult. And this was realized very, very early on in the colonial history. This quote from 1665 is emphasizing that is like many in a high measure feel the inconvenience and the inhabitants of all the streams or rivers within this government must be supplied with commodities from such vessels as shall arrive through Roanoke Inlet, which for aught we can perceive must always be a very small burthen. So the ships can't draw that much water going through. For although Captain I think that's probably White's vessel this winter, at her coming in found 15 feet water. Yet her going out just a few months later, she had but 11 feet. And though she drew not 8-foot water, struck twice or thrice, notwithstanding they had beaten, that's probably beaconed the channel, and well out in the best of it at full sea, so flood tide. So uncertain are those inlets. So they come in, the water's deep, but just a couple months later, they're going out. And even though the channel's been marked with beacons, with lights, on top of pilings, where the channel should be, they're running aground like 3 times. So it just shows you how unpredictable some of these inlets can be. Currituck Inlet. So there were 2 inlets actually that went by Currituck. You had Old Currituck Inlet, which closed up by 1731. Then you had New Currituck Inlet, which opened in a storm in 1713. It was 5 miles south of the old inlet. It was very shallow, usually only about 6 feet deep at high tide, and it closed up in the early 19th century. So, so a lot of times when these vessels ran aground, they would wait for the tide to come up, or they might lighter the vessel, so take a lot of the cargo out or shift cargo. But then you have Roanoke Inlet, which it too is shallow, only about 10 feet of water at high tide on the bar, and the approaches, it was only about 6 feet, and closed up too in the early 19th century. Ocracoke was one of the safer inlets to actually go through, although it was still pretty dangerous. It had much more traffic. So most of the traffic that was going to Port Currituck, Port Roanoke, Port Bath, they're going to be taking Ocracoke Inlet. 16 feet of water on the bar, but the swash, so you've got this field of shoals. You've got about 8 to 9 feet of water at high tide going through there. So it was trickier for vessels with that drew more water going through there. So sometimes they had the lighter. Beaufort Inlet was one of the deepest inlets in North Carolina, with ranging from 16 to 20 feet or more depth of water at high tide on the bar. And it had a nice large harbor in Beaufort as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Cape Fear River, the mouth, in 1731 was about 20 feet deep, but there's lots of sandbars and shoals between the mouth and Brunswick and Wilmington, which made navigation on the river a little bit challenging. This is actually a navigation map from the 1760s, actually a manual on actually how to get in to the mouth of the Cape Fear. And basically you can see all these shoals right here at the mouth, there, and there. So you got a narrow channel to get in through there. Then you had New Inlet, which was just above the mouth of the Cape Fear River. Very shallow. You go back and look at the colonial sources, there's lots of debates amongst the pilots as what type of vessel could actually get through there. Is basically agreed that small sloops that drew about 6 feet of water were getting in and out of there. So we'll talk about the exports. So those raw materials that are being pulled out of North Carolina to feed the homeland in England. So naval stores is North Carolina's #1 product. Tar, pitch, and turpentine, largely used to like seal the hull of ships or for waterproofing. Um, all kinds of uses. This is where the sort of Tar Heel name comes out of. It comes out of the naval stores industry. In 1768, 60% of all naval stores exported from North America originated in North Carolina. It was the biggest industry that the colony had. Brunswick, down in the Cape Fear, they dominated this entire industry. Beaufort was the second largest exporter of naval stores in North Carolina. In these images right here, the bottom one, you have men making turpentine, which comes from longleaf pine trees. And then on top, you have a tar kiln up there where you basically take pine logs and you heat them in a mound, basically, and you extract tar from it that way. Very dangerous, dirty work. Also, wood products are huge: lumber, planks, masts, shingles, staves, heading. The Cape Fear Valley, the lower Cape Fear, they dominated the lumber industry because they had tons of sawmills out there because of all the rivers and streams. Shingles and staves, a lot came out of the southern portion of North Carolina, but also the Albemarle region, that northeastern part, Port Curator, Port Roanoke. They also produced and exported a lot. So primarily, in terms of produce, what's being exported from North Carolina is corn, wheat, rice, peas. Largely corn and wheat. Most of that's coming out of the northeastern portion of the state. There's a lot of wheat that's also being produced in the interior of the state. Rice is almost exclusively coming out of the southern portion of the state. North Carolina is the northernmost region in which rice can be cultivated. And actually, there's not that much rice being cultivated in North Carolina because South Carolina and Georgia are dominating those industries. And their climate geography is actually much better for rice cultivation than North Carolina. Peas are also being made in the eastern part of the state. Livestock, cows and pigs, especially pork. Huge, even today, pork is still a big industry, and it was a huge one in North Carolina. Most of that being shipped out of Bath, Beaufort, and Port Roanoke. And then sort of non-food agricultural products, indigo, tobacco, and hemp. Again, indigo is coming out of the south, and tobacco and hemp is primarily coming out of the northeastern part of the state. And then deer skins were also a big export coming out of North Carolina, largely coming out of the sort of middle portion of the eastern part of the state to the northern. Then salted fish. So things like herring, shad, mullet, those are being caught on a commercial level and being exported out of Port Roanoke and Beaufort. Probably Port Roanoke is the biggest producer, and it's primarily herring, salted herring that they're exporting, and a lot of that is going down to the West Indies. Then the imports, basically everything that England is shipping into North Carolina, largely textiles, wool, linen, then metal household goods, pots, pans, that sort of thing. You might also have re-exported goods that are coming from either England or other colonial possessions like the West Indies. So sugar, molasses, tea, rum, salt. Salt's a huge one because you have to salt. Everything is preserved in salt. And then also enslaved peoples are being imported into North Carolina. Now, not nearly as many enslaved peoples are coming into North Carolina as South Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. There's several reasons why. North Carolina doesn't have a lot of money. They also the plantation economy doesn't quite take off during the colonial period. That comes after the American Revolution. Slave trade for North Carolina doesn't really take off until after the American Revolution. Very few enslaved people that do come in North Carolina. Most of the ones that are coming into North Carolina are coming into Port Brunswick because that is a deep port, can handle these slave ships that have deep draft. Some are coming from West Africa, but the majority are coming from the West Indies and neighboring colonies like South Carolina. So, and this just sort of shows where the enslaved peoples are coming from. Again, primarily the West Indies. So earlier I mentioned some protectionist trade policies that we discussed. I'm going to try and go through these pretty quickly. Now, there's all kinds of trade laws that Britain passes. There's all sorts of acts of trade, but the big ones that are really going to impact how the ports operate are the Navigation Acts, which are passed primarily in the 17th century, and they started out as responses to the Dutch because they fought all these wars with the Dutch. These are primarily trade wars that are going on, and so Britain's looking to protect its own trade, particularly that with the colonies. So you have Navigation Act of 1651. Goods from North America, Africa, Asia can only be imported to England and Ireland or any of the other English colonies in English vessels are predominantly manned by English sailors. Not necessarily English-owned vessels, but English-manned. So goods from foreign countries could be imported into England in foreign ships only if the goods and the ships belong to the same place. So in other words, if like Portugal wanted to import something, the ship and all the goods had to come from Portugal. The Navigation Act of 1660, then all of a sudden no foreign vessels are allowed in the English colonial trade. And then vessels in English colonial trade required, you had to have an English master, so a captain who is English, and 3/4 of crew had to be English as well. And then you start having enumerated goods, so specific goods that are listed out by the law could only be shipped from the colonies to English territories. And they use a bond system. So when you're about to either import or export a good, you'd go to the customs office and you'd fill out a bond and you would provide them with money as security. And then you'd go to the next port, and then the customs officer would sign off saying, yes, you did exactly what you're supposed to do. And then when you go back to your home port, you show them that signed stuff, and then you get your money back. Now, if you don't do that, then the government gets to keep your money. So that's how they're trying to keep people in line in terms of trade. Now, some of these enumerated goods, these are all the ones that are listed here by the late colonial period. The ones I have little stars next to, those are the ones that are largely coming, those are the biggest ones that are coming out of North Carolina. So turpentine, pitch, tar, a lot of that's coming out of North Carolina. That's included in the list of enumerated goods. It's making the most money. So then you have the Act of 1663, which non-enumerated goods, so anything that wasn't on that list, could be exported from colonies to foreign markets in English ships. And foreign goods destined for the colonies had to be landed in England and then re-exported to the colonies. So that costs shipping to go way up. But that's also making merchants, England, make a lot of money at the same time. So goods coming into the colonies get to be more expensive. Then the Act of 1673, ships, you saw this bond system for imports and exports are being used. And those goods would only be unloaded at an English port if bond wasn't first secured. Then the customs duties had to be paid on the enumerated goods prior to departing the colonies, plus posting bond to the governor's office. So you're going to be paying your taxes ahead of time and your posting bond. And so then you're going to have to come back to prove that you had actually delivered those goods as intended to get the rest of your money back. So very inconvenient. Now, the creation of the Customs Service happened by royal decree with Charles II in 1671. And this is basically something that's really going to govern the ports. Now, Parliament didn't really feel comfortable with the king just creating extra government bureaucracy without consulting with Parliament. So Parliament basically takes this royal decree and writes it into the Navigation Act of 1673. So they're like, okay, yeah, it would almost be like taking an executive order that the president passes and then kind of writing it into law later on. Now, the creation of the Customs Service in 1673 starts the first two ports of entry in North Carolina. That's Port Currituck and Port Roanoke. Port Currituck, it's kind of fuzzy where that was located. Also, Port Roanoke, we don't know exactly where it was located. I found one document that noted that it was at Sandy Point in the Albemarle Sound. So if you've ever taken the bridge from Washington County to Chelan County, it's where the bridge lands in Chelan County. That's Sandy Point. And so that's actually where a customs house was temporarily located at one point. Again, it's primarily serving those two inlets. And Thomas Miller was actually North Carolina's first customs collector. He was also the acting governor, too. Now, the responsibilities of the customs collector was basically to primarily collect taxes on goods that are being imported and exported. So cargoes couldn't be loaded or unloaded in a port without his consent. He ensured all the taxes were paid. He ensured all the proper bonds were given. And when necessary, when he found out someone was breaking the law, then he could seize the cargo and impound the vessel as well. And he's also responsible for enforcing quarantine. So if a ship comes in and the crew has smallpox, then he's the person responsible for enforcing quarantine. Then you had a comptroller, which is basically a clerk who acts as a check on the customs collector and monitors his activities and makes sure that he isn't getting into any sort of shenanigans and becoming corrupt or anything like that. Then you have a naval officer, which isn't what it sounds like at all. Basically, the port's naval officer is simply another clerk who may or may not be an officer in the Navy. And usually was appointed by the British Secretary of State for the Southern Department. There are multiple Secretaries of State. There's usually only one for North Carolina, and then he had deputies that were at all the other ports. And he kept all the records, so all the vessels that are coming in and out, he's keeping record of them. He's keeping record of the imports and exports, keeping records of the bonds and vessel registrations, and then he's sending all of that information back to England, back to the Treasury Department. And then you had a surveyor general, who are two government bureaucrats who basically supervise all the ports, and they keep track of the customs collectors and the comptrollers, and they make sure that those guys are following the rules and not getting into sort of shenanigans and becoming corrupt. So there's all these checks along the way. Then you have the Navigation Act of 1696, which is actually a response to Scotland incurring in on English trade. Now, today, Scotland and England are one country, or the two countries under sort of one system. But anyways, that wasn't the case. In the 17th century, they were not, Scotland and England did not become unified until the early 18th century. And so they didn't want Scotland competing in the colonies. And Scotland was actually competing in North Carolina. They were competing for North Carolina tobacco. And they had they're kind of cornering the market in that. So, so this law gets passed. Only English built, so not Scottish built, only English built and owned vessels could engage in colonial trade. The exceptions prizes, so if during a time of war, if like a French merchant vessel is captured and is kept by the English, it can also later be used in this trade. All English ships had to be registered. The customs officers were protected from physical harm. You think that was a no-brainer, that you can't assault a government official, but the colonists did not like the customs service. They did not like being regulated and taxed. And so bodily harm sometimes befell the customs collector. And the customs officers could search a vessel with a warrant, and they could have forceful entry. So they could break locks on hatches and raid vessels that they thought were involved in smuggling. And this also established the Vice Admiralty courts in the colonies. So the Vice Admiralty courts now have jurisdiction over all maritime law and trade in the colonies, which in a couple of months, I'm actually going to be doing a talk exclusively on the Vice Admiralty courts in North Carolina. But now we're finally kind of going to dig into all these ports. So, so Port Currituck, it's one of the first ports of entry in North Carolina. It's also the smallest. And we don't really know where it was located because there was no permanent customs house. So it always depended on where the customs collector lived or wanted to set up shop. So it was constantly moving, and the records are so poor, they're so scarce, that hardly any records still exist for this port of entry, so we know almost nothing about it. We do know that the Pasquotank River right here was the western boundary. Now, that's Port Roanoke. Sorry, folks. Port Currituck's to the north. Anyways, so yeah, it's limited to small vessels. The majority of the trade is being conducted with sort of the middle colonies, so New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. There's some trade with the West Indies, but not a whole lot. And then this nice little quote, the collection at Currituck, this is from the governor of North Carolina in 1736. The collection at Currituck I once knew laid down, the few vessels that have traded to this part of late years could have no other inducement for making their voyages than to carry from thence tobacco without paying the king's duty, so they're not paying taxes. I never knew one of the collectors of Currituck reside within the collection, which in my opinion is insignificant and useless. So the customs collectors aren't even showing up, and they're not even showing up to work. They're not even establishing a customs office. This trade is basically unregulated, and smuggling is running rampant. Then you have Port Roanoke, which eventually settles in Edenton, North Carolina. Edenton gets incorporated in 1722. The port of entry moves there, and it becomes the central hub of shipping in the northeastern part of the state. It becomes bigger and more important than Port Currituck. However, it's difficult to get there because most of the vessels going there aren't going through Roanoke or Currituck Inlet. They're going through Ocracoke. So they got to go up through the Pamlico Sound, then through the Croatan Sound, and then through the Albemarle Sound. And finally, they're getting there. Now it's a port of entry. Doesn't mean all the cargo is waiting for them there. You've got all these plantations that are on like the Roanoke River, the Chowan River, the Kashai River, all these different tributaries going into the Albemarle. They have landings, so they're almost their own little kind of, they're basically their own docks, basically. And you have vessels pulling up, and they're getting the corn and the wheat and the tobacco, and then they got to go back to the port and register all this trade, and then go out. So it's not a very convenient port, but it's an important one, which is basically what I just described. You do get primarily sloops and schooners. Fairly shallow drafted vessels are going through there. Some larger ones, some brigs, occasionally a ship. But all the larger vessels are going to have to lighter their cargo at Ocracoke to make it over the bar and through the Swash. So the trade at Port Roanoke, half of it, it's a primarily coastwise, so coastal trade, not a transatlantic, not very much involved in the transatlantic trade. Over half the imports are from other colonies, primarily from New England and the middle colonies. And over a third of the exports are also coming, their exports are also going to other colonies like New England. And then a lot of those items are then getting re-exported on ocean-going vessels back to England. Because again, due to the navigation, to the shallowness of the water, you can't get very many transatlantic going vessels into this area. And so less than a third of their exports are actually involved in a direct transatlantic trade. Now, the port did go into decline in the 1760s, partly because it's an inconvenient location and navigation is difficult, but also because the political capital of North Carolina moves from Edenton to New Bern. And so where all the politicians are, where the governors, where all the leadership, the political power in the colony is, that's where all the merchants are going to gravitate to that location. And so naturally, a lot of commerce gravitates to New Bern. So now I mentioned that Port Roanoke, Edenton, it's an inconvenient location. There's not very many ship logs for vessels coming in and out of North Carolina that still exist today, at least in North Carolina. But there's this one log that exists for this brig, Joanna. Now, she came down from Maine, went to the West Indies, and then went to North Carolina, and then went on to London. Now, the vessel departed the West Indies in January 1768. It was off of Hatteras by February 25th. It reached Edenton by March 1st, and then started up the Kashai River on March 2nd, and was hitting Gray's Landing, which is now Windsor, North Carolina, Blackman's Landing, Steele's Landing, to pick up its cargo. And it was dropping off rum as well. That was primarily what it was importing, into rum from the West Indies. And then it was exporting pitch, tar, turpentine, staves, and shingles. That was destined to go to London. Now, so they start going up the Kashai on March 2nd. They don't get back to Edenton until April 30th. It's like a month later. And this is not very, the Kashai and Edenton are like right next to each other. They're not very far apart at all. And then they don't pass through Ocracoke Inlet until May 17th, like half a month later. And then you have a 6-week voyage to London. Well, I mean, look, you've spent like 2.5 months pretty much in North Carolina just to pick up and drop off cargo. And then it took you only 6 weeks to get from North Carolina to London. I mean, You wind up spending as much time in North Carolina just trying to pick up your cargo as you did crossing the entire Atlantic. So kind of, pardon? They weren't. They weren't actually because they got caught. It was snowing. But that didn't really slow them down. It was just the navigation was that difficult and having to go in and out of these ports to register the trade and whatnot. And getting in and out of Ocracoke took up a lot of time too. So then you have Port Bath. Bath gets incorporated in 1705. By 1715, it becomes an important trade center, and this really contributes a lot to Ocracoke becoming very important. Ocracoke Inlet becomes also a port of entry in 1715, and but then it quickly went into decline. So by like the 1740s, 1750s, Port Bath is starting to become irrelevant because you have other ports that are taking off. Port Roanoke is taking up a lot of the trade, but also Newbern is much easier to get in and out of. And also, it becomes a sort of commercial capital for that sort of middle part of the state. So like I said, the vessels go in the Bath, they're coming in and out of Ocracoke. The Pamlico crossing it's pretty shallow. Y'all should probably know that you've been on the ferries. You'd see that's pretty shallow water out there. And then the Pamlico Tar River is navigable upwards for 20, 30 miles above Bath. So there's like places like Washington, which are just kind of slowly starting to become established. And then you've got all these other sort of plantations that are going up the Pamlico Tar as well that are conducting trade with that port. But 2/3 of the imports are from North American colonies. Less than 1/3 of the imports coming in from there are from the West Indies, and nearly half of the exports are going to other North American colonies, and half's going down to the West Indies. A lot of these ports, the frequency of where they trade, a lot of it has to do, and where most of their trade's coming in and out of, has to do with personal ties that those communities have with those other colonies. So a lot of trade is being conducted through family ties and friendships. So a lot of people that wind up settling in North Carolina are coming down from places like Massachusetts, Maine, some of those more northern colonies, and settling down. So they have families up in the north, and they maintain these familial networks. Also, there's a lot of families that are coming into North Carolina. Some families are also coming from the West Indies, and so you have commercial ties through families to the West Indies as well. Port Beaufort. Town gets incorporated in 1722, although people were living there before that, and they petitioned and became a seaport same year. The custom district gets enlarged in 1730 to include Newbern. Prior to that, Newbern fell under Port Bath, but then they switch it in 1730 to Port Beaufort. The customs district is enlarged in 1739 to include Bogue and Bear Inlets. So headed down to the western portion of Carteret County. And then Topsail Inlet, which is Beaufort Inlet, is one of the deepest inlets and one of the safer inlets in North Carolina. But here's a big problem with Beaufort. It does not have rivers that penetrate deep into the interior of the state. So you think of like Brunswick, they've got the Cape Fear River. That's navigable all the way up to Fayetteville. You got the Neuse River, goes deep into North Carolina. You've got Port Roanoke. They've got the Roanoke River, which is navigable all the way up to Weldon. So I think of like Halifax, North Carolina. The Chowan River is navigable pretty far north. Vessels can get into Virginia on the Chowan and Black Rivers. Carteret County doesn't have that. So it doesn't have a big market for imports. So yeah, it can export things like naval stores, but there's not a whole lot to bring in because you don't have a ready market there. So Carteret County, the population never really takes off. There's a French traveler that comes through Beaufort in 1765, and he writes there's only a dozen houses in Beaufort in 1765. And Beaufort doesn't get about, I think it's like 65 families until like the late, it's like the early 1770s, like right before the American Revolution. It finally hit 65 families. 65, I think 65 families was the minimum number of families you had to have in a community in order to get representation in the state legislature. And Beaufort got turned down because, okay, you got the population, but you're actually not important enough in terms of commerce and power within the state. So Carteret County is slow to develop in terms of population, industry, trade. It's isolated from the rest of the state. You got all these swamps too. There's very few roads also that are penetrating into the state. You've got a road from Beaufort to New Bern, but it's kind of tough. Yeah, Coarse Sound is too shallow to really navigate through. They do some lightering of cargo that comes into Beaufort through Coarse Sound and up to New Bern. However, you see more of that happening during the American Revolution than you actually do during the colonial period. And that's actually more of a necessity than anything else. And like I said, there's few roads and there's not enough rivers that go very far. And so most of the trade, though, is with other colonies, primarily New England and the Middle colonies. A lot of the people who settle Carteret County initially a lot of them are originally from New England. And over half of the trade, export trade, is with other North American colonies, primarily places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York. And then a quarter of the imports and export trade is with the West Indies. Less than 10, less than a tenth is with Great Britain. New Bern, interesting. It's settled in 1710. Originally, like I mentioned earlier, it falls under Port Customs District of Port Bath, then gets transferred to Port Beaufort District, and actually New Bern as a port under the sort of Port Beaufort gets more trade than Beaufort does. But the customs house is in Beaufort. And so when vessels are going into New Bern, the captain then has to get on a horse and ride from New Bern to Beaufort to basically just do paperwork and file taxes. And it's a huge waste of time. And everyone's like, this, even the governor is saying, this is really inconvenient. This is kind of stupid. Why are we doing it this way? So 1746, New Bern gets its own customs collector. So you get two customs collectors, one in Beaufort and one in New Bern. And so people no longer have to take a horse and ride from New Bern to Beaufort just to do some paperwork. And then it's no coincidence that they get a second collector when it becomes the colonial capital in 1746. The bulk of the trade is very similar to that of Beaufort's. Everything's coming in and out of Ocracoke Inlet. And the Neuse River is facilitating trade farther into North Carolina's interior than anything that Beaufort can offer, Beaufort being the town. Lots of plantations are along the Neuse River. A lot of turpentine, a lot of naval store production is happening along the Neuse River and going through New Bern. So then to the very south, Port Brunswick, Brunswick town, which you have a map of right there. You got the actual town, and then you got Cape Fear River is up here. But anyways, gets laid out in 1726. 1729 comes the seat of government for New Hanover County. and it's just 15 miles above the mouth of the Cape Fear River, and they're right below the flats. So all these kind of shoals that kind of would inhibit trade farther up the Cape Fear, they're just below that. So they're kind of in a sweet spot to allow transatlantic shipping to come in and out of that port. It's really the only port that does a lot of transatlantic trade in North Carolina. And it controlled the shipping on the Cape Fear. It's also North Carolina's busiest port. And so, like I said, you've got deep water port, deep water channels going up to Brunswick. Ocean-going vessels can come in and out. And it winds up dominating the naval stores industry because you've got all these barrels of tar and turpentine and pitch, which are really heavy, and they take up a lot of room on ships. So you need larger ships to carry this stuff. And larger ships are going to draw more water, and Port Brunswick is basically the only port district that's offering those facilities. And so naturally it winds up dominating the trade. Also, because of this huge trade it's able to engage in, you've got a lot of wealth that's coming into this area. So you have bigger plantations that are developing up and down the Cape Fear River. Now they do some rice and indigo cultivation, but the thing they're really developing isn't necessarily agricultural products, it's naval stores. And they're using enslaved peoples to produce those naval stores. And the bulk of the slave trade coming into North Carolina is really being used to fuel the naval stores industry. The Cape Fear is dominating. And like I said earlier, the Cape Fear River is navigable pretty far up. So most of all the import and export trade being conducted is directly being conducted with London. So vessels going to and from, they're going to Britain. And about 30% of import and export trade is with the West Indies. So still a significant trade, not as much as some of the other ports. Coastwise trade, so trade with the other colonies is pretty minimal. It's, compared to places like Roanoke and Beaufort, Currituck. So Wilmington kind of winds up as being sort of a similar situation as New Bern. So Wilmington began in 1733 as a village called Newton. And it's sort of at a strategic location on the Cape Fear River because it's at the confluence of the eastern and western branches of the Cape Fear, which they come together just right above Wilmington. So it's important because you've got all these plantations and all these settlements and little villages and stuff that are off the eastern and western branches. And Wilmington's able to capture the trade with all those communities and plantations. And it becomes sort of a commercial financial hub in the region. Now, they're kind of constrained by what type of vessels they can have because you've got these shoals in the river that kind of inhibit these transatlantic vessels, but they can send shallow drafted vessels from Wilmington down to Brunswick and get all these products into the transatlantic trade pretty easily. And I've kind of already discussed this, but so you also have some small river communities and landings. Halifax, North Carolina is one of these small communities, river communities. It's founded by merchants in 1757 who were really trying to promote trade on the Roanoke River. And the Roanoke is surprisingly navigable pretty far inland. Sloops and schooners of great burthen were making it all the way to Halifax. So Halifax is just below Weldon, which is sort of where the fall line is. So Halifax, Edgecombe County, that area. Um, It's also on a highway system, an inland highway system that's linking the colonies as well. So you've got land transportation and water transportation. And so Halifax does eventually become more important over time. Tarboro is founded in 1760. It doesn't really take off until after the colonial period, till after the Revolution. But it becomes a regional trade center on the Pamlico Tar River. Its vessels can't get up to it. It's too far inland. The river gets too shallow, but they're able to raft goods up and down the river. Um, and they also have access to somewhat decent roads, as similar to Halifax. Then you have Cross Creek and Campbellton, which are off the Cape Fear River. They're near what is today Fayetteville, and they're big in wheat flour production, primarily partnered with Wilmington and Brunswick in terms of their trade. Campbellton is sort of an offshoot of Cross Creek, and later those two towns basically grow into each other to basically form one community. Now, landings. Now, I kind of briefly mentioned landings earlier when I was talking about Port Roanoke, but basically it's a site where people and cargo can be loaded or unloaded from boats. So this can take a variety of forms. You can have like a cleared out little beach area on the side of a sound or a river, or you can have a dock or a wharf. Various structures are created. This map right here, you got all these little dots with all these little names off them. There's a bunch of land, these are basically where plantation landings are located off the Cape Fear River. And so these are where vessels can actually go to load and unload cargo. And you have these all along the Cape Fear, you know, the Neuse, the Chowan River, the Roanoke, so many different rivers. You've got these landings, and a lot of the trade is actually conducted in Colonial, North Carolina, is being done at these landings. You just got the ports of entry where a lot of these things are being kind of registered at. And you have public and private landings. So a private one would be like a plantation landing, but the colonial government also set up public landings, which would kind of be like your public boat ramps today almost, or like a public dock. And this is to facilitate trade. And where there was a public landing, they would build warehouses so you could, cart all your produce to this landing, put it in a warehouse and store it there and wait for a vessel to arrive to ship it on. You'd also have inspectors there because there's laws regarding quality control, for exports. And so you'll have government officials at these public landings inspecting the goods that are being shipped out and making sure they meet regulation. And wherever there's a public landing, there's roads linking them as well. Now, an example of a landing off the Roanoke River is Hogtown, which is where that red star is, just opposite of Indiantown. But anyways, the earliest mention of it is in 1752. It's Hogtown Landing, and then later on it's Hogton. The name and spelling kind of changes a little bit over time, but it's a center of commerce. It's in today where Martin County is today. But anyways, it's a center of commerce. You got warehouses, merchant houses are there. Trade is being conducted, and it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But maritime trade is happening there, inland. And it's 1755, it becomes an official inspection point. Then some of these landings actually become towns. A really good example is 1752 Blackman's Landing. Was supposed to have become Wimberley, a plantation landing owned by Joseph Wimberley was written into law. That landing was supposed to become a town. It failed. No one's sure why. But then Gray's Landing, which is where that red star is off the Kashai, it becomes the town of Windsor, which Windsor's still around today. It's the county seat of Bertie County. In 1787, which is after the Revolution, it's after the colonial period, but Murphy's Landing, which is off the Marion River, which Marion River is off the Chaun River, but becomes the town of Murfreesboro. Murfreesboro is still around today. So basically, there's a history of these landings where maritime trade is occurring, and it's part of all this stuff that we've been discussing. That towns grow out of these things. And then there's pilotage, which is the sort of attempt to improve the navigation. You don't get pilotage isn't formally created and regulated in North Carolina until 1715, and pilotage is kind of a mess throughout the colonial period in North Carolina. But basically, the governor's supposed to appoint pilots for Ocracoke and Roanoke inlets, and they have to lead vessels in and out, mark the channels. They can collect fees, which are defined by the law. And then to further encourage navigation, pilotage, lighterage through an Oak Inlet, the government tried to start a town of Carteret on Roanoke Island, kind of where Manteo is today. Now, that whole thing collapses, and they abandoned the plan in 1731. Well, during that time, New Bern and Bath have really taken off as being commercial centers and ports. And so also Roanoke Inlet is so shallow and dangerous to get in and out of. There's really no reason. You have people on the Outer Banks are migrating south to really serve the maritime traffic at Ocracoke Inlet. And so that's probably why this community fails. Then the pilotage law gets repealed in 1723, and you have no pilots in North Carolina until 1737. However, there is a law passed in 1723 where they're going to just mark the inlets and the channels, and the port commissioner is going to be involved, and Roanoke Inlet's going to have lighterage. But it's not a whole lot. It's pretty minimal. Now in 1738, they bring pilotage back to North Carolina. And you've got your port commissioners rather than governors hiring your pilots, although the governor has to sign off on everything. And the pilots this time are provided with boats by the colony. And they have to pay bond for performance. So they take an oath, and then they give money to the colony, to the government, saying, I'm going to do my job to the best of my ability in good faith. And if they don't, then they don't get their money back when they leave that job eventually. But they had to guide the vessels in and out of the inlets, as pilots do. But they also had to guide them to their port of destination. So you come through Ocracoke Inlet, and if someone wants to go to New Bern, you've got to guide them to New Bern. If they want to go to Port Roanoke, you got to guide them all the way to Port Roanoke. And you had to mark channels. Then the pilotage law gets repealed again in 1748, and there's no pilots operating between 48 and 51. And you might wonder why. Why do they keep repealing the pilotage laws? Well, the problem is they have a hard time keeping the pilots employed, because the pilots are complaining that there's not enough vessels coming through the inlets for them to make money to, feed and clothe their families. And then while they're bored, twiddling their thumbs, they start getting into whaling and commercial fishing or raising livestock on the Outer Banks. And they kind of drift away gradually from pilotage. And then when finally vessels do come, and they're kind of waiting offshore for a pilot to come to them, and no one comes to them, They just kind of either try and make it into North Carolina on their own, or they go to another colony like Virginia or South Carolina to actually conduct trade. So basically, they're like, well, we can't keep the pilots in place, so why even bother having this system? Now it gets reinstituted in 1752 because they're like, we really do need to encourage trade in North Carolina, so we really do need to help people. We don't want people wrecking their vessels or running aground in the inlets. Um, and so they appoint commissioners for the ports, commissioners of navigation, and then the commissioners make sure that the channels are marked and that the pilots get licensed and that the pilots are supervised and they're held to task, etc. And they had to pilot vessels to and from the ports of entry. And out of this system, Portsmouth gets established as a community. Now, there's a lot of tension going on within the colony over, is it Ocracoke or Portsmouth that's going to get a town? Eventually, they settle with Portsmouth, and a town gets created there to promote pilotage, to promote lightering. So you have these smaller, vessels can take the cargo off of vessels and put them, bring them into the port, and then allow the vessels to make it over the bar and the swash, and then they come in the port and get their cargo back or etc. But you have a safe harbor. You've got warehouses, homes, taverns, churches, merchant houses. All these things become established on Portsmouth. Now, 1751, finally, there's pilotage on the Cape Fear River. You think, well, there's been commerce since basically the 1720s. Took them long enough, took them like 30 years almost to have pilots there. But they have regulated pilotage by then, and they have all these sort of charges in place, and they're raised the charges over time, the fees. 1764, there's 12 pilots on the river, 8 between the bar and Brunswick, and 4 between Brunswick and Wilmington. And then they revised the laws in 66. Things are fees raised. Now, this is interesting. If a ship was driven offshore by bad weather after the pilot was had boarded the ship, he got compensated for his time that he's being forced offshore and had the extra time he's having to be on that vessel. And the pilots actually get fined for not helping vessels. And there's basically a system of accountability that's set up. And the quarantine is sort of attached to the system as well, where they have to, if a pilot has to inform the ports if vessels with sick people are coming in. Now, Ocracoke, you sort of get the rumblings of a town developing at Ocracoke in the 1760s. Now, there's a law passed in the session of 38, 39, where the government's supposed to be paying for the construction of houses for pilots on Ocracoke. That never happens. And probably one of the reasons why they have trouble keeping pilots employed. But in 1766, the colony finally gets their act together, and they purchase 20 acres on Ocracoke, and they lease it to the pilots, and they pay for the construction of housing, and you get Pilot Town, or Ocracoke Village, develops as a result. And then you have this sort of 1773 petition. This is actually pretty interesting, where you've got all these pilots that write this petition, send it to the governor, and they're complaining that you have Black pilots, some of them enslaved, that are operating at Ocracoke Inlet, and they're taking business away from them, and they want something to be done about that. Now, the government doesn't act on it, and we know they don't act on it because they don't pass any laws against it, and they file it away under rejected or not acted upon. And this is actually the original document. It's up at State Archives, that petition. Now, we're coming to an end now. And this sort of balance of trade that I mentioned earlier, where Britain's supposed to get the better end of the deal. And basically, all these exports that are coming out of North Carolina, they have a lower value than what's being imported into the colony. And so basically more money or valued products or more money is leaving the colony than what's coming into the colony. So you have a negative balance of trade, which isn't good for North Carolina's economy. And then after that, a lot of North Carolina's goods are being further devalued because they have real problems with quality control, even though there's inspection systems set up. You got contaminated naval stores, you got water and sand, and like pine straw is getting into the barrels and navels of like tar, pitch, turpentine, and it's not as good as the naval stores coming out of the Baltic. Poorly cured tobacco, so the tobacco isn't as good as what's being produced in Virginia. And the staves aren't being cut to the proper length, so they can't use them to make barrels that of the size that they want to. And so all these products are being further devalued. And so North Carolina is actually getting even less money for their trade, which makes Carolina cash poor. Poor Carolina. You might have heard that before. It's what people said about North Carolina in the colonial period. And this is some paper money from the 1750s and 1760s. But basically, mercantilism was discouraging the transfer of specie or gold and silver from the British Isles into the colonies. So North Carolina didn't have a whole lot of gold and silver. What gold and silver was circulating in North Carolina, a lot of it was coming out of the West Indies, a lot of Spanish, French currencies. So there's a shortage of this in North Carolina. Then the government starts printing paper money, and they print too much paper money, which you have rampant inflation. Things get to be way too expensive, so much so that in 1760s, the British government steps in and they start to regulate the currency with the Currency Act, which really upsets people in North Carolina because you're forcing them more to try and use specie, gold and silver, that they don't have. And the land taxes in North Carolina have to be paid in gold and silver. And then on top of that, there's more taxes that come in the 1760s after the 7 Years' War, after the French and Indian War, to kind of make up for all this money that this huge government deficit that the British government has, pass all these extra laws. Some of them you have to pay in specie. And this is the things that start to really upset the colonists. This is the things that are really starting to upset the people in North Carolina and driving them towards revolution eventually. What you wind up, due to a lack of specie and highly inflated paper currency, is a commodity economy, a barter-based economy. So people are trading goods. They're trying to say, okay, well, this many barrels of tar is worth 100 pounds, although that's constantly fluctuating because that's set by the markets in London, and it takes weeks to figure out what's going on in London. So it's a bit of a mess. But that's my presentation, and I hope y'all kind of understand what sort of maritime trade kind of looked like in North Carolina during this period. Is there any questions that y'all have for me? Yes, ma'am. So the indigenous population is thinned out very early on in the colonial experience in North Carolina. So a lot of it, a lot of the population is cut down by disease in the 17th century. And then on top of that, you have war. Some of it is with there's a lot of conflict between indigenous populations and the colonists. There's also internecine warfare, so warfare between tribes going on as well. and so there's a steady population decline. You had the Tuscarora War, which is about 1715, I want to say, which really kind of drives, it really starts to push them out of the eastern part of the state, the American Indian population. What's left of it, that is. So there, so some property was purchased from indigenous populations. Now, a lot of it, though, was Britain's just saying, we own this land from, basically they said from here all the way to the other side of America. And we're going to divvy out land grants to people who want to settle here. And so, we're going to give land away for nominal amounts of money just so we can populate this area. And then usually some of these land grants are pretty large, like hundreds, if not like more. It's like 1,600 acres. And then, those acreage get cut up and parceled out and sold. There's a lot of land speculation that goes on in North Carolina during the colonial period, where you have very wealthy individuals buying up large portions of land and then trying to sell it off as the population starts to grow more and more. I hope, does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, ma'am. In the early portion, there were issues with sort of crime at sea. Yes, but that gets stamped out pretty quickly by the Royal Navy. Yes, sir.
Remind me when they built the intercoastal waterway.
Well, so you had the first really big project was the Great Dismal Swamp Canal, which I think that was completed, I think, in the 1820s. And then after that, you had the Chesapeake-Albemarle Canal, which I want to say was completed in the 1750s, just before the Civil War. And then you had other canals. Our projects are conducted in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yes. So the whaling industry was part of the North Carolina economy. It was primarily in Carteret County and in portions of the Outer Banks. And I have a hard time saying how important it was. Now, I can say the Crown valued it. Fish, whales, sturgeon, and dolphins were called royal fish. And so there was a special tax placed on them. I think a tithe was paid to the Crown, so 10% of the value, I want to say. It's been a little while since I've studied that portion, but some of the earliest surviving licenses for whaling are from Carteret County. So Core Banks, Shackleford Banks. Actually, there used to be some on Bogue Banks as well. But primarily shore-based whaling. Any other, or actually before shore-based whaling, you had whales that were washing up dead on the shore, and those were being harvested for their oil, and their bone as well. So then after that, you have kind of shore-based whaling, and then vessels from New England would come down as well and engage in ship-based whaling off our coast. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, ma'am. March 6th lecture is one on whales, same time, 11 o'clock, and here in this auditorium here in Fort Macon. Yes. Anything else? Yep. All right, thank you.